All right, today we are diving into a really big idea, one that kind of messes with the maps we all have in our heads. It's all about the stories we've been told about the East and the West, and the incredible power that's hidden inside those stories.
So let's kick things off with a question for you. I mean, really think about it. Movies, books, the news. When you hear the East, what pops into your head? And maybe the more important question is, where did those images even come from?
Yeah, for most of us, it's a pretty familiar reel of images, isn't it? These sweeping exotic deserts, mysterious ancient traditions, and just this gut feeling that it's a place that's fundamentally totally different from us over here in the West. But what if I told you those images aren't just harmless cliches? One scholar came along and argued that, no, they're not random at all. In fact, they're part of this huge, carefully built system, and a system that's all about power. And the person who dropped this bombshell, that was Edward Said. This quote right here from his game-changing book, Orientalism, really cuts to the chase. He wasn't just talking about stereotypes. He was talking about a massive, centuries-long project of domination. So what on earth did he mean by that?
Okay, let's break this thing down. What actually is Orientalism, according to Said? Because it's way more than just a bad attitude or a simple bias. It's an entire system of knowledge. Here it is, the core of the idea. Orientalism is not just prejudice. Said called it an enormously systematic discipline. He argued that for hundreds of years, the West didn't just study the Orient, it actively produced it. It literally created a version of the East that it could then manage, rule, and control, politically, militarily, even in its imagination. Said says this thing works in three ways that are all tangled up together. First, you've got the academic tradition, the experts, the scholars who classify and define what the Orient is. Second, it's just a general style of thought that draws this thick, solid line between a supposedly rational West and an exotic backward East. And third, and this is the real kicker, it works as a corporate institution, a tool that empires use to justify their rule. All three of these feed each other, creating this incredibly powerful machine of control.
Now, Said didn't just pull this out of thin air. He was a brilliant synthesizer, standing on the shoulders of some pretty heavy-hitting thinkers. So how'd he connect all the dots?
He basically wove together three huge ideas. From the philosopher Vico, he got this notion that we can only truly know what we ourselves have made. So the Orient, as we know it, it's a Western invention. Then, from Michel Foucault, he borrowed the concept of discourse to show how this invention wasn't just a bunch of stories, but a whole system where creating knowledge about something actually gives you power over it. And finally, from Antonio Gramsci, he took the idea of hegemony to explain the system's most powerful trick, getting the people being ruled to buy into the logic, to see it as normal, as just the way the world works. But, to really get where this powerful idea comes from, you have to get the man behind it. Edward Said's own life is absolutely key to understanding his work.
Edward Said's life was really defined by this feeling of being displaced. He was born a Palestinian in Jerusalem, was forced into exile, and ended up becoming a world-renowned professor in the US. But he always felt like an outsider, never fully at home anywhere. And he took that personal experience of being in exile and turned it into his most powerful intellectual tool.
This is what led him to develop his idea of secular criticism. And no, this isn't about religion. It's about a state of mind. It's about being skeptical, always challenging the official story, the accepted dogma. It's a way of thinking that refuses to be bought or co-opted by power, always asking, wait a minute, who does this version of the truth really serve? And this is the bottom line for Said. He believed that to be a real intellectual, to really speak truth to power, you had to be an outsider. It's only from that position of exile, whether you're literally exiled or just feel that way, that you can get the distance you need to see the systems of power for what they really are. So about 15 years after Orientalism rocked the academic world, Said came out with a follow-up called Culture and Imperialism. And in it, he laid out this brand new way to read, well, pretty much everything, to find its hidden connections to empire. He called it contrapuntal reading. He actually borrowed the term from music. See, in counterpoint, you have two or more separate melodies playing at the same time, weaving together. Said we need to read books like that, to hear the main story, the one happening in, say, a quiet English countryside, but also listen for the faint, drowned-out melody of the colonies that's making that quiet life possible. At his most famous example of how this works in practice, you're probably not going to guess where it comes from. We're talking Jane Austen, specifically her classic novel, Mansfield Park.
So, in the novel, you've got the Bertram family living this very elegant, comfortable life on their English estate. But where's the money coming from? Oh, just a little mention of a sugar plantation in Antigua. For most readers, it's just a throwaway line. But for Said, that line is everything. He argues that the entire world of the novel, all its moral dilemmas and its quiet civility, rests on the silent, brutal foundation of slavery happening thousands of miles away. Contrapuntal reading makes you see that connection, it makes you hear that silence, it links the beautiful English manor to the Caribbean plantation, showing you they're two sides of the very same imperial coin.
Now, look, a book this big, this revolutionary, it was always going to start a firestorm. Orientalism sparked decades of fierce debate, and it's really important we look at the critiques. The most famous showdown was with the historian Bernard Lewis, and their fight really gets to the heart of the whole thing. Said argued that the modern problems in the Middle East are a direct legacy of European colonialism. Lewis shot back that no, the problems are mostly self-inflicted, coming from internal things like culture and religion. This was not just some dusty academic debate. This was a fundamental clash over how we understand history itself. And there were other serious critiques, for sure. Some people said, hey, wait a minute. In your attack on how the West lumps the East altogether, aren't you kind of doing the same thing to the West? Others pointed out that his focus was pretty narrow. He talks almost entirely about the Middle East, but what about China, Japan, or Southeast Asia? And a big one was that he spent so much time dissecting Western books that he kind of ignored the voices and writings of Arab scholars themselves. So, despite all the debates and all the arguments, Said's impact is just undeniable. So what's his ultimate legacy? Why are we still talking about a book from 1978? Why does it still matter so much? Well, for starters, he pretty much kicked off the entire field we now call post-colonial studies. Thinkers who came after him, like Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak, they built on his work. They also challenged it, focusing on things like cultural identity or how marginalized people are silenced. But Said was the one who laid the groundwork, the one who first mapped out how knowledge and power work together to build and maintain an empire. And that really brings us to his most powerful, most lasting legacy. If you're going to remember one thing from all this, let it be this. Said taught us that culture is never, ever separate from power. A novel, a painting, a scholarly article, none of it is pure. It's all connected to the world, and the knowledge it creates is never innocent. So, I want to leave you with this question to chew on. If Said is right, if the knowledge we consume every single day, from the news we watch to the history books our kids read, is never neutral, how does that change the way we look at the world? And maybe more importantly, what does that demand from us as people trying to think for ourselves?